Good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you. Whichever one it is, I'm very glad you're here to join me for this week's video, because today I'm going to be telling you about all of the books I read in April. There are 12 in total. I read some of these on audiobook. Some of these are rereads of my favorite books of all time. There's favorite authors in here. There's a new favorite book. And yeah, overall it was a very successful and very diverse reading month. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get right into it. Because the first book on this list, the first book I read and finished in April, is Paradise Lost by John Milton. I've been wanting to read this book ever since I saw this one specific art lecture on YouTube, which there's all of these lectures published online for anyone to see, and this specific one was about a painter, an American landscape painter, who painted darkness in an incredibly profound way. And the professor who did this lecture quoted Milton, Paradise Lost specifically, and this was long before I ever picked this book up, but it's why I really wanted to read this. And the quote is, "A dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible." That sentence, darkness visible. I get goosebumps just thinking about that. This quote has been living inside of my brain more than a year before I ever read this story. And in my opinion, it's one of the greatest quotes in all of literature. I am incredibly glad and so happy to have finally read the story, or the poem technically it comes from, because of course Paradise Lost is one of the founding pieces of Western literature. I did not start with this one. I started with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. I read all of these classics that were to me a bit more accessible, because to me Paradise Lost is about the Bible. It's basically John Milton's account of man's creation and the world's creation. It's the biblical story of man's fall from paradise. I was a bit more intimidated of this one than I was of the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, all of those other epic poems, because this one is based on religious texts. And religion is one of those things where I have a very complicated relationship with it, and my education on religion is not very deep. I was a bit scared that because I have never read the Bible, and because I tend to stay away from religious writings, I was not going to understand what this book was referencing, because I did not know how much of a prevalent role biblical references were making in this book. And so I basically read all of these other epic poems first in order to build up my confidence slowly. And I finally felt ready and excited to actually read the story, because I felt like this was a time where I was going to be able to appreciate the treasure trove that is this book. And I am very happy to report that although I did not get every single reference without looking it up, there are some references to very niche topics that happen in the Bible, certain characters, for example, but I only looked those up because I like to really understand every single thing that's said in literature. And I do not think you have to know everything about the Bible to appreciate and enjoy this book. I don't think I would have needed all of the preparation I did for it. But I'm still glad I did it, because that meant this book was surprisingly easy for me to read and to understand, because this is kind of funny, but I read the Aeneid in the translation of John Dryden, who was someone who lived not exactly contemporary, but around roughly, very roughly, around the same time that John Milton wrote this story, which means that I was already familiar with the kind of writing of an epic poem of that time. And the cool thing about this is it's the first epic poem, the first fundamental classic of literature that I could read in its original language, because of course I don't know ancient Greek or ancient Roman writing, so I could never read any of those in their original form. I'm so happy that I know English enough to read and love this story, because there's so many, the amount of quotes and the amount of goosebump inducing lines that this story had, especially in the beginning. I really, really loved the parts where the devil was in it. Reading this story, I kept wondering how someone who is Christian would read this story, how they would feel about this story, because to me, as a non-religious person, the devil was the most well done character. I liked the devil the most. I thought he was the most complex and the most relatable, which might be my own bias, my personal bias, or just my own very specific lens I had that I viewed this story through. But to me, God and Adam and Eve and all of the angels surrounding God seemed a bit narcissistic and very unlikable. And I'm not sure if that is actually how this was written, if that was the purpose, or if that was just how I experienced this story. But I just kept wondering, if I were Christian, would I like this story as much as I do? Or would I like the devil as much as I did in this story? Now, that being said, of course, the devil is not a good guy, but I liked how complex he was, and I thought some of the things that were said about him were very, very relatable as a human. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is the way we are now is because the devil inserted himself into our lives. I have no idea how far the biblical message goes in this book, or how far John Milton was trying to critique the Bible. I do need to do some more research, and I'm really interested in doing that research now, because now I have all of these questions that this book made me feel and think about. It's insane, because basically on every page there was something that just blew my mind, how relatable and how modern those quotes were. Basically all of them came from the devil. Oh, I finally found it. Thank goodness. This is on page 99. It's one of the quotes I like the most in this story. But I think for this to make sense, I maybe should first talk to you about what Paradise Lost actually is. We start out with the devil being banished from paradise with all of these lackeys of his, because he was trying to usurp God's throne. He was trying to steal God's power, and that was not okay. So God punished them by banishing them, the devil and his lackeys, from heaven, and now they're basically in hell, to make it simple. The devil is so mad about this suffering that God has induced that he decides, I will punish God back, but I cannot punish God himself, so I will punish God's masterpiece, so humankind, which at this point is just Adam and Eve. And so the devil tries to get into paradise, and that's where we're at. He's just tried to get into paradise, and he's found out about this thing called the Tree of Knowledge, which is the one thing that man is not allowed to do in paradise. I mean, this is basic biblical knowledge. I think everyone knows this, but they cannot taste from this tree of knowledge, because then they would be banished. Then God would have to punish man. This part is basically just the devil wondering about how strange it is that man can only be happy in ignorance. The quote goes, "All is not theirs, it seems. One fatal tree there stands, of knowledge called, forbidden them to taste. Knowledge forbidden, suspicious, reasonless. Why should their Lord envy them that? Can it be sin to know? Can it be death? And do they only stand by ignorance? Is that their happy state?" Can you now understand why to me this reads like a complete critique of the Bible? I have not done the necessary research to understand what Milton was trying to say here, but that is definitely going to happen soon, because I think that's very profound criticism of religion. There's one more, and then I promise I'll stop talking about this book. This is Satan being confronted by Gabriel after having tried to get into paradise. And Gabriel basically saying, how dare you not obey God? How dare you not comply with this banishment of God? And Satan basically says to Gabriel this: "Gabriel, thou hadst in heaven the esteem of wise, and such I held thee. But this question asked put me in doubt. Lives there who loves his pain? Who would not, finding way, break loose from hell, though thither doomed? Thou wouldst thyself, no doubt, and boldly venture to whatever place farthest from pain, where thou mightst hope to change torment with ease." This is brilliant. Why is the devil so fucking brilliant? I had no idea that was how my experience with this story was gonna go, but I suppose the devil is my favorite character. I am very sorry if that is hedonistic of me. I loved this book. This is one of the most impressive books I've ever read and one of the most impactful. That was Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, next up, we have The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. I quickly talked about this book in one of the videos I did, I think the holiday vlog, because I was reading this before I went on holiday. And I said this already, but I'm going to say it again. It has a sergeant on the cover. Can you see this? This is one of my favorite sergeants of all time. Is this not just gorgeous? I had to get this. It has a sergeant on the cover. That's all I need to know. The only book I'd read by Henry James was The Turn of the Screw, which is an entirely different reading experience. And when I picked this book up, I had no idea what was in store for me. I did not know Henry James was capable of writing these kinds of stories, but I'm so glad I discovered that side of him, because now I really want to read all of the other books he's written. First of all, the writing is so witty, so funny. There were many lines that not only did I want to underline, but that actually made me chuckle, because they're actually funny. It reminded me of Oscar Wilde a bit reading it. As for what this is about, we basically follow Isabel Archer, who is a very young woman. She's inherited a bit of money, and her aunt takes her from America, where she lives, to England, where her aunt lives. Basically, the story is Isabel's life, the portrait of a lady called Isabel. She is a very fascinating character. She refuses to get married. She covets her freedom and her liberty, and she knows the moment she gets married, no matter how kind her husband is, she will not be free anymore, because that was just the life of a woman at the time. And so even though she has some really, really kind men who want to marry her and who promise her freedom, she refuses them, even though some of them she might actually really love. She loves her freedom more, and she loves her independence more, and she has all of this thirst for life and for experience and for making her own mistakes. And she knows she can only do those things as a single woman. From a man, I was not expecting this, especially not at the time the story was written. I'm very glad, though, that this happened, because it changed my perspective on literature a bit, and on this man specifically, of course. Every woman in this story is a very strong, a very headstrong character, and a very distinct person. They're all very fleshed out, and none of them are stereotypical. And I loved them so much for that. There was this one Henrietta. I loved Henrietta. She's my favorite. She's this sort of journalist kind of person, and I loved her. She's my favorite. What I had a bit of an issue with was how this story closed, how it ended. To me, it bought into too many stereotypes. I wished it had ended differently. But that being said, I can see why Henry James ended it the way it did. I think in a way you could see this ending as the point, because the ending really drives home the point that Isabel was trying to make the whole time, that a woman will not have freedom once she marries. I completely see the point of it. It made this story less enjoyable. That was The Portrait of a Lady. Next up, we have Raising Demons, which is the very last book I had not read by Shirley Jackson. Now I have read everything this woman has ever written, which is very sad, because she's one of my favorite writers. She's one of my favorite authors. But this had to happen eventually, and I have never read a book slower. I read a few chapters, or this book doesn't really have chapters, but a few pages a night. This book took me longer than Paradise Lost, because I did not want it to end. It's the second part, basically the sequel to Life Among the Savages, which is Shirley Jackson's first semi-autobiographical account of her life in the 1950s as a housewife, a female writer, and a mother of 4 children. It's so completely different from anything else you will ever write from Shirley Jackson, because it's not the kind of thing she usually wrote. And it's the most intimate account into this woman's life and into her mind that you could ever get, because although it's fiction or semi-fictional, it's still the most personal thing she's ever written. Especially if she's one of your favorite writers, especially if you love Shirley Jackson, this will be such an enjoyable and interesting and enriching experience to read this story. But even if you don't, I think this is just such an enjoyable read. I will reread everything this woman has ever written, because what else am I gonna do? I can't just not read Shirley Jackson ever again. So yeah, this, loved it. Highly recommend. Then we have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is one of my favorite books of all time. This is a reread. Piranesi is one of the most special books I've ever read, and I cannot really talk about what it's about. So all I can tell you is it's about Piranesi. He's our main character, and the story is basically written in these sort of logbook entries. It's a sort of diary, and he documents his daily life in this house he lives in. He's a sort of scholar, you could say. He documents the goings on in this house he's in. The story goes from there. It becomes so deep and so profound. I won't go into why, because I think that's a spoiler. I think for this book, even the genre, this book, I would place this book in, is a spoiler. When you have a book that's so special to you and you reread it after quite a while, there's always this element of fear in it, because what if it's not as special the second time? What if you don't like it as much anymore? But with this one, I think I like it even more now, because of course this story is written in a fairly disorienting way. Being confused at the start is the whole point, and of course you're gonna be explained the things that are happening. You're not gonna end up confused, but for a while it's just, you don't really know what's going on, and that's the point. But reading it a second time, you're no longer confused, and so you experience this story like it's for the first time. That is Piranesi. I highly recommend it. Next up, we have To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I think Virginia Woolf is the best writer that has ever lived, and probably will ever live. Every single line in any of her books, but this book, I'm going to talk about specifically this book. Every single line in here is a philosophical thought experiment. And to manage to write a novel with compelling characters, with a compelling story, and a very unique story, and to manage to make that in itself compelling, but to make it being written in a way that makes the story feel like a philosophical thought experiment from first line to last line. There's so many layers to this woman's mind and to this woman's work. This is about the Ramsay family who lives on the Isle of Skye. It's the woman, the man, and their 8 children. And it's about the guests that come to that house and to the Isle of Skye and that are involved with that family. We start at the beginning with the youngest son of this family, who keeps wanting to go to this lighthouse that's off the coast of the Isle of Skye, of where they live there. The trip to the lighthouse becomes the central sort of framing point of this story, because the son keeps wanting to go there and the father keeps saying, no, we can't, it's too dangerous. With Virginia Woolf, there's really no end to the amount of interpreting you can do, because there's so much symbolism going on in her stories and there's so much depth to them. But yeah, this trip to the lighthouse, or the lighthouse itself, is one of the framing aspects. The other framing aspects is a painting that one of the guests, called Lily, she's an artist and she is with the Ramsay family at the beginning of the story, and she is constantly working on this painting she's trying to do of the Ramsay family. This painting is the second sort of framing point, because it comes back at the end. The reason why this is one of the most impactful stories of Virginia Woolf's to me is this one specific passage in this story where time becomes the narrator. It's such a brilliant little piece of writing. I cannot explain to you how much I love that. This is one of those stories that I think really enrich someone's life. And I think it's so worth reading. That was To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. An incredible experience the second time around, just like the first. Next, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, which is my first Anne Bronte. It is motivated by the fact that before we went on holiday, I went through this week where I watched any and every documentary I could get my hands on of the Bronte sisters. Knowing all of these new things about these sisters and their lives, I got so fascinated by them that I really wanted to read all of their stories. Before this, I had only read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is one of my favorite books of all time. I think it's so complex and I love that story. And I'd never read something from it. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is one of her major works. It's maybe her most famous. We basically start out from the perspective of this man who's a sort of farmer who lives in this small town in England. A woman and her young son move into Wildfell Hall, which is a sort of manor, an estate in this town. The rumor mill starts doing its thing. He falls in love with this woman. She seems to reciprocate those feelings because she gives him her diary in order to explain how she got to this point. It's not a fun story to read. What makes this story take on so many layers is that the Bronte sisters had a brother who was thought to be an alcoholic, and they had to take care of him for a while. One of the main motifs in this story is alcoholism and the effect that has on the people around someone. This is personal to her, and you can tell this is a very personal story. I really like this story. I recommend it. Pick it up. Next up, the new favorite book I was talking about that I read this month. I read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is the story of Edmond Dantes, who is a sort of sailor. He works on a ship, and he's just come back to Marseille from a 3-month-long journey. Everything in his life seems to be going perfectly. He's engaged to a beautiful woman who he loves, who loves him. He has a very good relationship with his father. He's just about to be promoted to captain on this ship. But of course, we're not going to stay in the happy state for much longer. There's these 3 guys who decide they want to eliminate Dantes from their lives because each of them stands to profit from that in a different way. And so Dantes, at 18 to 20 years old, is imprisoned, comes out of prison, and he decides he wants revenge. This, justifiably so, is called the quintessential revenge story. In every way possible, it's such a profound story. This story is so complex. It has a very intricate plot, but the characters are also incredibly written. No matter how many settings or characters there are, because of the way it's told, it's never difficult to keep track of anything. The writing is incredible. It's so poetic but so simple. Observations on human psychology, the human experience, and on life in general are so profound. This story is so rich in references to art and to literature and to culture. It's in every way a perfect story. I made a video where I talked very, very extensively about this, so I think I'll stop talking now. Anyone will love this. Pick up The Count of Monte Cristo. Now we have, coming back to my little Bronte obsession this month, we have the completed poems by Emily Bronte. This is basically every poem that is known to have been written by her, with the caveat that we don't know if they're original. It's a very difficult job to try to compile the complete poems of Emily Bronte, but I'm very glad people are trying, because that means I could now read this. It's very clear that there is certain themes that are drawn throughout her works. It's life and nature and death and grief. Specifically, she seems to have loved the night and to have found a lot of comfort in the night. Because of the amount of tragedy in her life, you can really feel Emily Bronte trying to express herself in these. It's such a personal work. I think anyone can find things to relate to in these poems. I think I want to read you this, which is not the best representation of the amount of feeling in her works, because there's poems in here that are much more relatable to me and that have much more feeling in them. But something about this poem, about the rhythm of it, made it stick in my head. This was the one I kept thinking about. The poem goes, "The night is darkening round me, the wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs weighed with snow, and the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. Clouds beyond, clouds above me, wastes beyond, wastes below, but nothing drear can move me. I will not, cannot go." I've gotten goosebumps now. That was the complete poems by Emily Bronte. Then I read Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, which this is the German edition because Thomas Mann is a German classical author and I'm German, so I'm gonna read Thomas Mann in German. The secondary title, you could say, is Der Verfall einer Familie, which is, if you translate that, it's the decline of a family. You follow this family, the Buddenbrook. If I remember correctly, 5 generations of the Buddenbrooks. There is not one central main character. Thomas Mann, in my opinion, took these and made a critique, a societal critique out of it. The Buddenbrooks are very rich people. They're the upper class of society at the time. And if you don't know, in the 1830s, Germany was going through a lot. Poverty and inequality was so prevalent. The working class people were starting to rebel more and more. And so this book starts out during a time where things were very chaotic in Germany. Thomas Mann did something very interesting with this story, because he basically takes the bad guys, the nobility, the people who were oppressing the working class, and he makes them the protagonists. And so the Buddenbrooks end up being his way of critiquing that kind of society, because the Buddenbrooks are clearly meant to be ridiculous. You cannot take these people seriously. But one thing I do have to say is, I don't think you would enjoy this story if you don't really like history. I fear you could find it boring if you don't. That is Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. We have Howard's End by E.M. Forster, which is my first ever Forster. I wanted to read this first because it's the one I found the most compelling. We followed these 2 sisters, Helen and Margaret. They're very different sisters, and Helen is writing to Margaret to tell her about this trip she's taken to Howard's End, which is the house of the Wilcox family, who are a family they met recently. She's writing that she fell in love with one of the sons of the Wilcox family. Things happen from there, and it's set from 1908 to 1910. It's a very turbulent time in England. It's basically the transition from traditional England to modernity. Difference is the main theme of this story. Difference in terms of familial difference, political difference, the difference of traditional versus progressive, societal difference, class difference, also the difference of genders. It's a very multifaceted story. E.M. Forster writes in a way that I love, because it's simple, but it's profound. He critiques stereotypes by almost playing into them. The sisters especially are the main way this is shown. There's so much character development and so much just in general going on in this story. I thought it was a very good one. I really liked it. It was very enjoyable and very fascinating, and it's a very good point to start with E.M. Forster. Apparently he said this was probably his best work. I am very glad I started with this one. I'm definitely gonna pick up his other work because I loved this one. I fell in love with his writing and with his way of viewing the world. That's Howard's End. Then I picked up The Professor by Charlotte Bronte, which is her very first ever novel. It was published posthumously. Her husband basically edited it a bit and then published it, because during her lifetime this was seen as too controversial to publish, which is ridiculous if you read the story. I read it on audiobook, not physically, and at first I was very close to not finishing this story because I thought it started out very, very boring. I did not like the writing. I did not find the characters compelling, but I'm very glad I stuck with it. We follow this man who has just been orphaned and he's looking for a job, and in order to get a job, he goes to this town where his brother lives, who he's estranged from. They barely know each other. He gets a job with his brother, but the brother is a very bad guy. He treats him very badly. But then the main character quits his job with his brother and he goes to Brussels to become a teacher, a professor as they call it there. From there on, things picked up. I never loved this story. I think it's my least favorite of the Bronte works I've read thus far, but it gets better. What I think is the reason why this story was considered controversial, or why no publisher wanted to pick this up while Charlotte was alive, is that the female protagonist of this story refuses to quit her job after being married. The main character of this story is inspired by this professor Charlotte in real life worked alongside, because she was also a school teacher for a while. She got very obsessed with him, and it's unclear what kind of nature their relationship had, but it wasn't a successful one because he was married and he refused to leave his wife. Knowing that, it read a bit like what she wished would have happened to her. It's not a bad book by any means. Charlotte is a good writer and many people think she's the best one of the Brontes. I think it's just I personally don't connect to her stories in the way I do with Emily, and now I see that Anne, I probably like Anne more than Charlotte too. I have started to read Shirley. That one That's by Charlotte too, and I love that one. I think the writing is miles better than here. Maybe my favorite Charlotte is just in my future still, and maybe I just have not read the books I'm gonna really love by her, so things may change, who knows? I'm always open-minded about that. That was The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. The last book on this list is one I have not finished yet, but the month is technically not over and I will finish this month. I'm determined to do that because I love it. It's a fairy tale by Stephen King, by the way. Here, now you can see. I said this already in another video, but I have a quite interesting relationship with Stephen King because at first I thought I didn't like him. I tend to not enjoy vulgarity in literature. And so, of course, Stephen King writes fairly vulgar, at least for my tastes, which made him quite difficult to read or enjoy at first. But every story I read by him, I just get sucked into. My favorite by him is also the first by him I read. It's Insomnia. I think that book is criminally underrated. Even if you don't like Stephen King, Insomnia is a masterpiece. I love it. But now I'm going to shut up about that because this is about fairy tale. I really, really wanted to read a Stephen King suddenly. I think because university is starting back up and that always makes me very nervous. I'm just the kind of person who gets really nervous before things like that. And so I needed something that was comforting. And something about Stephen King is just comforting to me. And so I picked up the book I owned by him, Fairy Tale. Basically, we follow this boy called Charlie. He's our main character. And his mom died in a car accident when he was 7 years old, and his father became an alcoholic because of it. So Charlie's childhood was very tough. And he made this deal with God. He begged God one day when he was still a child, God, if you make my father become sober, then I will do something good for you in return. And his father becomes sober. And so Charlie takes this deal very seriously. At the present time of the story, he's 17 years old. He tries to do good as much as he can. Through circumstances, he inherits this certain key. A key to another world. And that's where this story becomes sort of a fairy tale-like story. It's a very modern take on fairy tales in general. There's a dog in the story. It's a German Shepherd, and she's called Radar, which I think is such a cool name for a dog. It's the perfect escape. That is Fairy Tale by Stephen King. And with that, we're now at the end of this month's reading. These are all of the books. It's a very precariously stacked little thing. I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. We're gonna say bye now. Take care of yourself and we'll see each other again next week. Bye-bye!